The courtroom in Silver Creek, Montana was packed to capacity on the morning of Anna Hartley's trial. Every bench held spectators who'd come to witness justice delivered to the woman who'd killed her husband. The facts, as presented by the prosecution, were simple and damning. Benjamin Hartley had been found dead in his own barn, shot twice with a pistol that belonged to Anna. She'd been discovered standing over the body, gun still in her hand, her dress covered in his blood. There were no other suspects. No alternative explanations. Anna herself had confessed to pulling the trigger. The only question was whether the jury would recommend hanging or life in prison. Anna sat in the defendant's chair with her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. She was 31 years old, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that held no tears, no pleas for mercy, no visible emotion at all. She'd lived in Silver Creek for 7 years, ever since Benjamin had brought her west from Ohio as his bride. In those 7 years, she'd become known as a quiet woman who kept to herself, who rarely smiled, who seemed to fade into the background of every social gathering. Most people in town couldn't have described her personality if asked. She was simply Benjamin Hartley's wife, notable only for her connection to a man far more prominent than herself. Benjamin had been a respected businessman, owner of the town's largest mercantile, a deacon at the church, and a pillar of the community. His death had shocked everyone. That his wife had killed him had shocked them even more. Women didn't kill their husbands in places like Silver Creek, or if they did, it was because of some dramatic reason that the community could understand and perhaps forgive. But Anna had offered no such reason. When questioned by Sheriff David Monroe in the hours after Benjamin's death, she'd simply said that she'd shot him because she couldn't live with him anymore. That wasn't an explanation that generated sympathy. The trial proceeded with grim efficiency. The prosecution called witnesses who testified to finding Anna with the body. They presented the murder weapon, which had Anna's fingerprints clearly visible on the grip. They established that Anna had purchased the pistol 3 weeks before Benjamin's death, that she'd practiced shooting at targets behind the barn, that she'd planned this killing deliberately rather than acting in a moment of passion. The defense attorney, a young lawyer named Charles Webb who'd been assigned to the case because Anna had no money for private counsel, did his best to suggest that there might be mitigating circumstances. But Anna refused to let him present any defense that painted her as a victim. She sat through the testimony with the same blank expression, neither confirming nor denying anything said about her. Sheriff David Monroe watched from the back of the courtroom, troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate. He'd been the one to arrest Anna, to take her statement, to transport her to jail. He'd expected to find a woman broken by what she'd done, or defiant or hysterical. Instead, he'd found someone who seemed relieved, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. In the 3 months she'd spent in jail awaiting trial, David had checked on her daily, as was his duty. He'd brought her meals, ensured her safety, and found himself increasingly disturbed by the growing sense that he didn't understand what had really happened in that barn. David was 42 years old, had been sheriff for 15 years, and prided himself on his ability to read people. He could tell when someone was lying, when guilt was genuine, when circumstances were more complicated than they appeared. Looking at Anna, he saw guilt, yes, but not the guilt of a cold-blooded murderer. He saw something else entirely, something that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war. Men who'd done terrible things, not because they were evil, but because they'd been pushed beyond human endurance. The prosecution rested its case, and the defense called its only witness, Anna herself. Charles Webb asked her to explain why she'd killed her husband. Anna's answer was simple and devastating in its brevity. She said that Benjamin had been hurting her for 7 years, that he'd isolated her from any potential friends or family, that he'd controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to what she ate to when she was allowed to leave the house, that he'd beaten her regularly, always in places where the bruises wouldn't show, that on the night she killed him, he'd threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. She said she'd believed him completely, and she'd realized that her choice was simple: kill or be killed. So she'd chosen to live. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 60s who'd presided over the territorial court for 20 years, pounded his gavel and called for order. When the room finally quieted, he asked Anna why she hadn't reported this abuse to the authorities. Anna's answer was calm and matter-of-fact. She said that Benjamin was well respected, that she was nobody, that she'd learned years ago that no one would believe her word against his. She said she'd tried once to tell the pastor's wife about the bruises, and the woman had told her that a wife's duty was to submit to her husband's authority, that perhaps if Anna tried harder to please him, he wouldn't need to discipline her. Judge Harrison's face showed no emotion as he listened to this testimony. When Anna finished, he asked if she had any proof of these allegations. Anna said she had only her word. The judge nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He instructed the jury to disregard any testimony about alleged abuse, as there was no evidence to support it. He said that the facts were clear. Anna Hartley had deliberately and with premeditation killed her husband. The motive she'd provided, even if true, did not constitute legal justification for murder. Under the law, she was guilty. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation of hanging. Judge Harrison scheduled the execution for 3 weeks hence, thanked the jury for their service, and dismissed the court. Anna was led away in chains, still showing no emotion, still composed as if she'd expected exactly this outcome. David Monroe stood outside the courthouse as the crowd dispersed, feeling sick to his stomach. He'd enforced the law for 15 years, had arrested murderers and thieves and all manner of criminals. He'd never once doubted that what he was doing was right. But watching Anna being led back to jail to await her execution, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. The law had determined she was guilty, but he knew with absolute certainty that she was innocent in every way that mattered. That evening, David did something he'd never done before. He went to the jail and asked to speak with Anna privately. She looked surprised to see him but agreed. They sat on opposite sides of the cell bars, and David asked her a question he had no right to ask. He asked her if she regretted killing Benjamin. Anna thought about this for a long moment. Then she said no, she didn't regret it. She said that killing him had been the first autonomous decision she'd made in 7 years. She said that even if they hanged her for it, she would die knowing that she'd finally taken control of her own life, even if only for a moment. David felt tears forming in his eyes, which shocked him. He was not a man who cried, but listening to Anna speak with such quiet dignity about her impending execution, he felt something break inside him. He said that he believed her. He said that he understood why she'd done what she'd done. And he said something he'd been thinking about all day but hadn't had the courage to articulate until now. He whispered so quietly that only she could hear. "The judge called you guilty. But not to me. To me, you're innocent." Anna looked at him with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been surprise. She asked him why he was telling her this. David said he didn't know, except that someone needed to acknowledge that the law and justice weren't always the same thing. Someone needed to see her not as a murderess, but as a woman who'd been forced to make an impossible choice. Someone needed to bear witness to the truth, even if the truth wouldn't save her. Over the following 3 weeks, David visited Anna every evening. They talked about everything except her impending execution. Anna told him about her childhood in Ohio, about dreams she'd had before Benjamin, about books she'd loved to read. David told her about his own life, about becoming sheriff, about the loneliness of his work. They developed a friendship that was strange and profound, built on the shared understanding that their time together was finite and precious. David also did something else during those 3 weeks. He investigated. He talked to shopkeepers who remembered Anna coming in with bruises. He talked to women who'd whispered about Benjamin's temper. He talked to a doctor who'd treated Anna twice for broken ribs and had suspected but never reported domestic violence. He compiled evidence that should have been presented at trial, evidence that painted a very different picture of Benjamin Hartley than the community had accepted. 5 days before the scheduled execution, David went to Judge Harrison with this evidence. He laid it out methodically, showing a pattern of abuse that had lasted for years. He argued that Anna had acted in self-defense, that she'd had no other option, that the law should protect women like her rather than condemn them. Judge Harrison listened to all of it with the same stern expression he'd worn during the trial. When David finished, the judge said that the evidence was compelling but irrelevant. Anna had been tried and convicted. The law had been followed. The sentence would be carried out as scheduled. David left the judge's office knowing he had one option left, one that would cost him everything he'd spent his life building. That night, he went to the jail and told Anna that he was going to help her escape. He said he couldn't watch them hang an innocent woman. He said he knew this would end his career, would probably result in his own arrest, but he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. Anna refused. She said that she appreciated his belief in her innocence, but she wouldn't let him destroy his life for her sake. She said that she'd made peace with her fate. She said that dying with dignity after having finally stood up for herself was better than living another 40 years as Benjamin's victim. She said that David had already given her the greatest gift possible by believing her, by seeing her as human rather than as a criminal. That was enough. The night before the execution, David sat outside Anna's cell for hours. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much left to say. But as dawn approached and the executioner began preparing the gallows, David did something spontaneous and desperate. He unlocked Anna's cell and told her to run. He said his horse was saddled outside, that she could be miles away before anyone realized what had happened. He said he would face the consequences, but she needed to live. Anna stood in the open doorway of her cell and looked at this man who'd chosen to see her humanity when no one else would. Then she did something unexpected. She kissed him gently on the cheek and whispered thank you. But she didn't run. She walked calmly to the gallows as the sun rose over Silver Creek. David Monroe resigned as sheriff that afternoon. He couldn't continue enforcing a law that he no longer believed in. He left Silver Creek and moved to California, where he worked as a ranch hand and tried to forget the woman he'd failed to save. But he never did forget. For the rest of his life, he carried the memory of Anna Hartley, the woman the law had called guilty, but who'd been more innocent than anyone he'd ever known. And he carried the knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply bearing witness to another person's truth, even when you can't change their fate.